I'm Kyle Roed, and this is the Rebel HR Podcast. Rebel HR is a podcast for HR professionals who are ready to make some disruption in the world of work. Follow us online on Facebook at Rebel HR Podcast, rebelhumanresources.com, or follow me on Twitter at Rebel HR Guy. All right, Rebel HR listeners, I'm extremely excited for our guest today, Doug Claffey. Doug has an impressive resume. He is the founder of Energage, making the world a better place to work together now more than ever. Doug, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
So I'm extremely excited about today's show. I'm a huge data guy, and Doug actually has data related to the craziness of 2020. So Doug, why don't you just start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and your organization and what your organization does?
Sure thing. So just a little bit about myself and why I'm a data guy also. So my background was not HR, it was aerospace engineering, started out as a rocket scientist, and clearly data is really important in rocket science. But my passion and my interests were more how people work together and bringing a science and data-based approach to the challenge of how people work together. So I co-founded Energage with the purpose of making the world a better place together now 14 years ago, and bringing that background of rocket science and data to a problem which historically had been considered a much more squishy, soft problem. So today, Energage is a purpose-driven company. We help organizations turn employee feedback into business intelligence, and also into credible employer recognition through our top workplaces programs all across the nation. Just to give you a sense of the amount of data we've accumulated, we've surveyed more than 66,000 organizations, 22 million surveys, and so well over 500 million points of data on what it's like to work in a good workplace, a great workplace, and a lousy one. And so we take all that data and we're able to really provide organizations with benchmarking, with analytics and guidance to help them understand and improve their work. And then we're also able to provide recognition for what's great about these workplaces. Now, I think what may have piqued your interest was in June, we released some research findings, specifically what's happened to employee engagement through the pandemic. What surprised a lot of people is that employee engagement went up. And so I just want to pause for a second and check in and see if that's was a surprise to you as much was to me. But certainly right when first things started, I kind of expected all the uncertainty and doubt to cause a dip in engagement.
Yeah, that's exactly what prompted this discussion. I was fascinated to hear a little bit about the research, and in my very small sample size in my company, we saw the same thing. We anticipated that employees would be upset or nervous or scared, and what we saw was people were more engaged than ever. Collaboration went significantly up at our company. Our communication actually improved because we were forced to use all these virtual tools. And, so all the things that were on my HR list, things like improve communication, drive engagement, increase collaboration amongst departments, it all happened through no strategy of my own. It had to happen to keep the business moving forward. And then, so we saw that initially. And now I think that it's maybe normalized a little bit or leveled off. Is that what your research is showing you?
Well, so it's interesting that you mentioned about employees being clued in or about communications, because that was the number one driver of culture and engagement in terms of improvement during the pandemic. And so we saw, on average, employees being about 20% more positive on feeling clued in, feeling like they're being well informed about what's going on in the business. And that really carried from about April through July pretty steadily. Now, along with the other drivers of engagement, in August and September, we saw the numbers go back more to their traditional levels, about even with last year, or maybe even down just a hair, but a pretty marked decline from that April to July timeframe. So would say that they had I hate to say go back to normal, given that nothing is normal right now or new normal, but we certainly saw them dropping back down to more historic levels and maybe just a little bit lower.
Yeah, I think as I've been talking to people and on the podcast and just other HR professionals in general, I think that's the consensus amongst my peers that things were really, really good, kind of shockingly good. And now we're kind of back to the same old as it relates to morale and engagement, productivity, all those things.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of truth in that. A lot of the discussion in August and a lot of the fear, uncertainty, and doubt was around return to school for an awful lot of employees who had made it through the remote learning back in the spring, but we're now looking at really huge levels of uncertainty around whether school would be in, whether it would be hybrid, whether it would be remote only, what the implications were for childcare, what the implications were for their own working environments. And we saw that hit right around mid-August, the really fear, uncertainty, and doubt around the return to school. And then in September, we're seeing just a slight uptick in terms of overall engagement levels, but now many employees are dealing with the return to school and the realities of often trying to be a parent, a teacher's assistant, and an employee at the same time.
Yeah, myself included. I have three kids, 2 in school, 1 supposed to be in preschool, but currently home preschooling, if that's a thing. And my spouse, who is a saint, who is working from home with her organization, and me back in the office. So I think the stress levels of my employees that are, especially employees that have kids, have certainly spiked this fall. So I'm curious, I'd like to maybe take a little bit of a step back and talk a little bit about engagement in general. I think engagement is one of those buzzwords that maybe has lost a little bit of meaning because people use it in almost every aspect of employee behavior. So as you look at engagement and as you actually work to measure engagement, what do you look at? What criteria do you consider to be an engagement driver, and how do you start to analyze that?
Great question. And I would agree with you that the term engagement went through a bit of a hype curve where it got very popular. And then all of a sudden we bumped into companies who were selling lunches to companies and saying, well, that's engagement, clearly, is lunch. And and it's not the way that we think about it. So we think about engagement as the intersection of 3 things. So it's employees who are motivated to give their best. They want to stay at the company, and they want to recruit their friends to work there. And so those 3 elements, motivation, recruitment, and referral, are kind of big 3 for engagement. Now, those are all outcomes in that if you try to tell somebody to be motivated, probably not going to work very well. And so we look at drivers of culture that drive culture and engagement. And we've really broken those down into 4 major areas. One is around alignment. Are people aligned on values and direction, where you're headed? The second one is around connection. So do you feel like a sense of emotional connection to the company? Do you feel appreciated? Do you feel like the work is meaningful? Do you feel like that you're appreciated in the work that you do? The third one is around coaching. So do managers take a coaching role? Do they help you to learn and grow? Do they help to remove obstacles? And then the fourth one is around performing. So do you and the company get stuff done? Do you innovate? Do you accomplish the mission and purpose of the company? So those are the big 4. It's align, connect, coach, and perform. So we measure those. We measure employees' perception of those 4 different areas. We measure engagement, and that's those 500 million data points are looking at those drivers of culture, drivers of engagement, and then engagement itself. And so when you pull that apart and you take a look at what's happened during the pandemic, the area that has seen the strongest uptick is really that retention piece, the intent to stay. So We're seeing people less likely to be looking for other jobs. We saw a little blip in August for that, but really it's been consistent through April all the way through September. People want to stick around. When we look at the other two components of engagement, so motivation was up about 10% from April through July, back down to more traditional levels in August and September. And then the referral, similar story. So the one that's really holding is retention, and so we are seeing people sticking around and not really looking to move in these really uncertain times.
That's fascinating, and I think it's an interesting thought exercise. Is that because companies are doing a good job, or is that because of the macro factors and the unemployment numbers?
So it's going to be both, right? There's not one of the challenges in people science is you don't get easy answers that are true for everybody. And so the external environment is going to have an impact, and then the internal environment is as well. Our survey is of aspiring and top workplaces, so we're generally measuring the better workplaces. So my personal guess is that it's more of the wanting to stick around, and that not only is the grass not greener right now, it's maybe a little browner than it would have been a year ago.
Do you anticipate that this trend will continue and that people are more than they were pre-pandemic because they were retained and not laid off, or they're in the right industry? Do you have any insights there?
So it depends on the industry. Where people can be very productive working from home, we're starting to see more aggressive recruiting from some of the bigger players. So some of the very big players, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Twitters, are now recruiting nationally, and recruiting in our home city of Philadelphia, for example, when they don't even have an office there. And so we haven't started to see the numbers move dramatically from that, but what I expect we'll start to see is a more mobile job market for people who can work out of their home. And external force will put pressure on retention for all of our HR folks out in the audience. Now, HR is always both trying to keep the good players, but also trying to recruit good ones from others. And so the good news from that is that the pool that you can play in as a recruiter when you're trying to recruit in talent doesn't have to necessarily be as geographically bound as it might have been before. And so you can recruit from a much broader market. What we're seeing is that the big trend, and this has been maybe over a number of years, but it's been exacerbated now in the pandemic, is that managing your employer brand is becoming more and more important for smaller businesses as that recruiting market starts to go from being local to national to global.
I agree 100%. A case study for you. So my company, very small compared to Facebook or Target or some of these massive employers that are doing a lot of hiring right now. So we've had to be very intentional about our social media strategy. We've had to digitize a lot of our recruiting processes so that we can actually capture individuals that find out about our jobs online. And we're trying to be cool, which is not something my company ever had in mind 5 to 10 years ago. It was hey, we do good work and you should like to work here. And now it's shifting to, we need to have a burning platform for somebody to want to work here, and then we need to make sure it's a great place to work so they stick around.
It's super hard, and I'd say that the social media environment makes it even harder. And so I don't know if you've had a chance to see The Social Dilemma, big Netflix special, just highlighting how some of these big companies have used social psychologists to really manipulate people's perspective. And within our business, within HR and recruiting and employer branding, we've seen some of the same kinds of forces happen in that we've seen in the broader social area. We've seen trolling. We've seen companies, manipulating their their brand through trying to get postings that are favorable to them, and it really leaves the employee or prospective employee just kind of not sure where there's credible information out there to learn about a place to work. And it's a pretty big investment to take a job to learn what it's like to work in a place and then find out that it's not for you. And so finding tools, finding ways to credibly, authentically understand what it's like to work at a place before you go there has just become really, really valuable. And that's an area that we've focused a lot of effort in over the last few years.
No, I think that's a great point. And then, I just had this conversation a few days ago about Glassdoor, which for like HR, it's almost like this love-hate relationship, because it's open source, right? Anybody can go and say anything about your company. So if you have a bad experience with somebody who is offboarding from your organization, you have a bad recruiting experience for a candidate, people can find out, right? I always caution people, before you go assume that Glassdoor is 100% correct, see how many people on there gave it a 1 star. Those are probably people who had a bad experience. Count those up because they'll skew the data. But then also go look and see how many interns filled out the the ratings, because I guarantee you somebody in HR or somewhere said, "Hey, welcome to so-and-so company. First step, go give us a great review on Glassdoor. We'd really appreciate that. And gosh, it'd be great to get the word out there."
Well, yeah. So we did some research into this. We survey an awful lot of companies. So we were able to company where we had surveyed everybody in the company, gotten their feedback on it, and then look at the Glassdoor responses to line those up, not individually, but to try to understand statistically whether there was a significant skew in the data. And maybe not surprising to your audience, huge skew towards the disaffected, highly disengaged, and it really misrepresented the company. Now, as you probably know, Glassdoor actually encourages companies to go and encourage, as you say, interns or others to post. So if you have a program that's actively posting and it becomes this a little bit of a social war between the trolls and the sort of actively trying to promote the positive sides of the culture, and then the employee who is reviewing that Glassdoor data doesn't know what to believe, and that's one of the reasons we've put Top Workplaces out there as a research-based approach that surveys a statistically meaningful set of the employees of a company, or all of them if it's a smaller company, and you don't have this bias in the data, which ends up providing a skewed version of it.
Yeah, I had thought about that the companies that are actively engaged in responding to Glassdoor might be the more accurate reviews.
You said love hate. I'm not sure how much love there is out there for it, but it's a I think if companies can find alternatives to Glassdoor to get their credible branding information out there, certainly ours is one with topworkplacesusa.com. Great place to go and learn about how to get your employer brand out in a fact-based and research-based way.
Yeah, so that's really fascinating to me. Can we explore a little bit about what the Top Workplaces program is and how you leverage that to showcase an employer brand?
Sure. So Top Workplaces started out as a region-based program when I founded the company 14 years ago, and we started with a single program in Delaware. We expanded to 50 major metros across the United States. And just this past year launched Top Workplaces USA to cover the best places to work across the country. It is a free program to participate in, so there's not a barrier in terms of cost to get in. We survey all of your employees if you're below a certain threshold, and can survey a statistically significant portion if you're above a certain size. And we run that diagnostic we were discussing earlier, so measuring engagement and the drivers of culture to find out where you stand as a company, where your hotspots are, where your weaknesses are, but also where your strengths and areas to celebrate. And then we publish the top workplaces to work for. And in the past, that's been more of a binary thing where we'd give out some special awards, but also mainly you were in or out. For 2021, we'll be expanding that to cover off the best places to work for women and women-led companies, for diversity, equity, and inclusion, for remote working, best places for managers. So we're going to start to really peel back the onion a little bit to give better insights into why individual places are great places to work, but also where are the very best places to work and the practices that they're the new practices that they're bringing into the workplace.
That's free for an employer to participate in that survey?
Yeah, it's free. It's topworkplacesusa.com. You go there, you can nominate your company, and there's no cost to go through it. Now, there is a charge for the detailed feedback if you opt to come into that. So that's certainly how we stay in business. But we do offer the diagnostic, and the designation as a top workplace is free.
That's interesting. And I'm just reflecting on my company. When I first started, there was no HR budget for anything like that. If I wanted to go to a survey, I would have had to go fight, every other department budget to try to find the funds. So could be a great way, if you're in HR, to leverage some of that data-driven results in order to build a business case that maybe you do need to focus on some areas of your business, and you need to prioritize some of these what you described as squishy costs that are really hard to quantify. But I think we can all agree that some of these intangible things are just as critical as cash flow and productivity metrics, because the people are what make your business work. So if you don't treat them appropriately, then it's not going to work. We'll put the link in the show notes so that our listeners can find that.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I would say that while I know your listeners believe that there's a tie between engagement culture and company performance, we've been able, through our research into public companies, to actually see that tie. And so we know that companies that are more highly engaged, that have cultures of engagement, outperform the stock market. And so that is as we turn into 2021, we live through this pandemic, we move on past it. The notion that people aren't your greatest asset, I think, is just going to get to be more and more antiquated. And so how do you measure? How do you manage? How do you improve? And how do you stay relevant to employees in this next coming decade?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that line of thinking, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges for HR is to articulate that to the right leaders and to their organization. And then I think one of the biggest challenges in HR is that you can say, well, people are our biggest priority, but we're going through a global recession period, and a lot of companies are having to cut benefits and freeze pay raises and things like that. So what tactics are you seeing out there for companies that are trying to communicate that people are their priority, but having to make these really challenging business decisions?
Couple of thoughts. The first one is that employers need to be listening, and that means more than a once a year survey. They need to be listening through their management structures. Senior leaders need to be connecting with employees directly through Zoom calls if they need to, or other mechanisms. They need to be using pulse surveys in smart ways to make sure that they're keeping a pulse on their employees. And they need to learn. The worst thing you can do is stick your head in the sand, or we call it FOBR, fear of bad results. So say, well, I'm not going to ask because I'm afraid of the answer. Beyond that, and to your point around around some of the difficult challenges that businesses are facing, sometimes having to freeze benefits or cut pay or furlough workers or maybe even have to do layoffs. It's companies need to be transparent. They need to close the loop with employees, but also ensure that they're keeping employees as their highest priority throughout the process, even if they have to go through some of these difficult decisions. And so one of our top workplaces, Power Home Remodeling, had to do some furloughs because their business really stopped overnight. But they spent a lot of effort and a lot of senior leadership time engaging with the furloughed employees because they knew that when they came back, when they had the opportunity to come back, they wanted those employees to come back to Power Home Remodeling Group and not somewhere else. They wanted to make sure that they felt a sense of connection to the company, even as they weren't necessarily, working day to day. So it's not a binary decision where you say, well, do we, manage our business or take care of our people? It's both. How do we manage through the challenges, and in the worst case, maybe have to go through furloughs or layoffs, but do our best to take care of our employees who remain, but also the ones who have been furloughed or maybe even have had to be let go. So, and people remember that for a long time too. So it's not just now. It's going to be, as recovery comes through, employees are going to remember who took care of their people, who did their best that they could, that were transparent as they could be, and then that those companies are going to be ultimately rewarded by folks who want to stick around there and give their best and refer others to work there.
I love a good acronym. FOBR, fear of bad results.
Yeah, there are cases where the person with their head in the sand and their hands over their ears is right. And so if the plan is to run the employee engagement survey and then completely ignore the results, not feedback to the company, not share that the voice of the employee is being heard, then you probably shouldn't do it. Now, the opposite end is if you treat the employee survey as like a ticketing system and customer support where every single input is going to be addressed, that way lies madness also, because you can't treat an employee survey as a customer support ticketing system where every single bit of input is going to be addressed. You can't run your business that way. And so the sweet spot's in the middle, not surprisingly. And this is where asking employee opinions with a good employee survey that's authentic, research-based, that's got a science base to it, that's got benchmarks associated with it, that is actionable, but is also going to allow you to take those actions in alignment with running your business and making sure that you're creating value for your investors, for your customers, and your employees at the same time. Because if you treat those as separate and orthogonal, to use a rocket science term from my past, you're going to fail. And so you really want to make sure that you have alignment between those objectives. There are cases where you shouldn't run that survey, and that's not a great place to be, where you're actually better off with your head in your sand because your intentions aren't great. So
right, yeah, it's worse to ask the question and then do nothing about it than to just not ask at all, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. You ask the question and then they answer, and then you say, actually, I didn't care at all what you said.
Yeah, thanks for that opinion, but I don't care.
Yeah,
go back to work.
Remember what you said.
Yeah, that doesn't work very well.
No.
When you were describing the other approach, like the ticketing system, all I could think about was it's like the DMV, where you go in and you take a ticket and you sit there and just wait, and you're like number 175 and they're now serving 5. That was my envisioning of that description. So not the DMV and not the head in the sand.
Right. And imagine if you went to the DMV and you said, in terms of an input or your employee survey, you had 10 or 15% of your people who said, I think you should raise our pay by 20%. Most businesses can't afford to do that, and particularly now. And so that there's a setting expectations, there's understanding, where you have leverage, where you can align the business with where you're improving your workplace for employees, and just making sure that you set out with a plan that is going to be one that you can follow up on.
Yeah, that's a great point. I have yet to meet somebody who, if you ask them, would you like to make more money? They've said, no, I'm good.
Well, I'll tell you, and this is interesting. Employees at top workplaces make that decision every day. And it's really the opposite of golden handcuffs. And so we know from our research that people will take a little bit less money to work at a really great workplace. And it takes a lot more money to work at a terrible workplace because life is short. And, if you're spending your time at a lousy workplace where your boss is yelling at you, you're not sure how your work is aligned with the work that you're doing. And then they're like, we really want you to stay. It's like, well, you're going to have to pony up for that. And so people really do make that decision every day.
Yeah, that's a great point. So to the senior executive who's, well, probably not listening to this podcast, but the senior executive that does not want to do the survey and feels like this isn't a priority, is that enough of a business case for you? Hey, you don't have to pay people as much for them to stick around.
You don't have to pay people as much to work at a great workplace as you do at a lousy one. Absolutely.
I think that's one of the biggest challenges is, and I mentioned earlier, I'm a big data guy, but it's trying to draw the line between financial impact and people practices, good people practices. And for me, I look at it as these types of things, they're very proactive versus a more transactional focus on the business. I just think as I reflect on the conversation, I think about these top workplaces, I feel like, and their employees probably articulate this, they just kind of get it. They get that, right? Are you seeing that in your survey research?
So it's a little bit like Maslow's hierarchy in that when you talk about people practices, there are some table stakes items like pay and benefits and training and work-life flexibility that are all important for recruiting and retaining employees, but they only get you to a certain point. They're not the thing that makes the difference unless they're lousy. So they need to be good enough. Those four I just mentioned, and then you start to move into the areas that really do make the difference. So are people connected, aligned? They feel like they're being coached? Do they feel like they're performing? That's what gets people out of the bed on Monday morning and saying, wow, I'm looking forward to going to work, as opposed to, oh my God, I dread going to work. It is not that, certainly the benefits and the training are foundational, but they are not the thing that makes the difference. And to your point around drawing a line between those, we've been doing some research, some pretty exciting research I mentioned earlier with the public companies to look at the drivers that align with public company performance. And I think by the time this podcast goes up, we should be announcing some of that. So maybe you can put those in the notes as well.
Well, we are closing in on time here, so I want to make sure that we put you through a critical component of the podcast, which is our Rebel HR Flash Round.
Okay.
So we're gonna put you in the white hot spotlight here, and I'm really fascinated to hear your responses here. This is the first time that we'we've had a rocket scientist on the podcast. So
former rocket scientist, just to be clear.
Hey, you know what? You got the degree. I think you can own that. I just keep that on LinkedIn. That's compelling. All right. So flash round. Question number 1. What are you reading right now?
An author I really like is Cy Wakeman. She wrote a book called No Ego. Just can't recommend that book strongly enough. And I've read it and sometimes reread it. And so that's one I would recommend.
I am a huge Cy fan. I've seen her speak a couple times. I love that book. My first exposure was reality-based leadership. One of my managers gave that to me, and I was hooked. So yeah, strongly recommend that. Love that series, and the approach to the actual psychological principles that drive behavior. So if you're an HR person and you just can't figure people out.
Yeah, Cy and I have become friends, and just really can't recommend her work enough. And she's got podcasts and her books, but the No Ego is a great one. And as you mentioned, reality-based leadership is really good as well.
Okay. So there's a lot of thought leaders out there. And a lot of times it's hard to separate the noise from the content. So who should we be listening to?
So we already mentioned Cy. I think if you get a chance to listen to Cy Wakeman, she's a great thought leader. I really do like Adam Grant and feel that Adam kind of cuts through the noise and has a very evidence-based and research-based approach, is very approachable, and so would recommend Adam as well.
Gosh, we're right on the same level here. So I love Adam Grant. Got to see him at a national SHRM conference in Chicago a few years ago. And the way that he describes things, it just made sense. And you could tell he's clearly a good, I think he's a professor at Wharton, but great descriptions of the things that we should be doing. And I still use his interview tech. He gave us an interview technique on how to figure out if somebody has integrity or not. I've used it ever since. It's so great.
I'm going to share it with your audience real quick.
Yeah. So the tactic is to ask, instead of asking somebody, do you have integrity? Because they'll always answer yes. You ask somebody, what percentage of the employee population do you think steals from their employer? And the principle there is that the people that say the higher number are more predisposed to steal from their employer. So that's a measurement of integrity in an interview.
I do want to give a shout out to one other thought leader. Dan Ariely is the author of Predictably Irrational, written a number of behavioral psychology bestsellers since then. He is working with one of our partners called Irrational Capital and helped to found that. And just a brilliant speaker, thinker, really comes at things from a different perspective. And if you get a chance to really see him on CNBC or Wall Street Journal or one of those, just a great thought leader.
Great content. All right, last question in the flash round, and then I'll let you off the hook. How can our listeners connect with you and your organization?
So best place is to come to topworkplaces.com and register your company to go and learn about whether you're qualify as a top workplace, what aspects of your culture are great, and what aspects of your culture might benefit from some focus.
And Doug, I understand that you are doing a webinar to inform some of your followers about some of the results.
So this Tuesday, October 13th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, I'm going to be interviewing Dan Ariely. It's a live broadcast webinar, and so would encourage folks to find out more by just coming to energage.com, and you'll be able to see a link to the webinar right at the top of energage.com.
All right, and we will include that information in the show notes as well if anybody has any interest. I know I'm going to be curious to hear what the results tell us. So
Dan is always entertaining, so we'll be curious. I'm curious to see what he's going to say as well.
All right, even better. We like entertaining.
Thanks so much, Kyle.
All right. Thank you again, Doug. Really appreciate it. All right, that does it for the Rebel HR podcast. Big thank you to our guests. Follow us on Facebook at Rebel HR Podcast, Twitter at Rebel HR Guy, or see our website at rebelhumanresources.com. The views and opinions expressed by Rebel HR Podcast are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any of the organizations that we represent. No animals were harmed during the filming of this podcast.
Baby.